Before she saved them, they said her hands were meant for silk, not soil. Before they lined up at her door with empty bowls and emptier pride, they called her the woman who ate weeds. It was a name spoken in the pinched, sidelong whispers of Providence Gulch, a place that prided itself on straight lines, straight furrows in the field, straight planks on the church, straight morals in the heart. My Lin, with her quiet ways and her grey silk cheongsam that flowed like smoke around her ankles, was a curve in a world of rigid angles. They did not understand her, and so they feared her. Have you ever held a truth so firmly in your hands that the world's disbelief felt like nothing more than a passing breeze? A truth learned not from books or sermons, but from the earth itself, from the patient observation of what grows in the forgotten spaces, in the cracks between the ambitions of men. This was my Lin's truth. And in the year the sky turned to brass and the earth to powder, it was the only truth that would matter. She had arrived with Thomas, her husband, a man whose kindness was as wide and steady as the plains but whose courage in the face of his neighbor's judgment was a more fragile thing. He had found her in San Francisco, a world away from the dust and wind of Providence Gulch, and had been captivated by a stillness in her that he mistook for simplicity. He brought her back to his small, clapboard house at the edge of town, the one that bordered the unruly expanse of scrub and prairie. He thought he was giving her a home. He did not yet understand she had brought her own home with her, a knowledge of the world that did not require 4 walls and a shingled roof. The women of the town, led by the formidable Beatrice, whose husband owned the general store and thus the town's very lifeline, tried to absorb her. They brought over dense, sugary cakes and offered advice on how to properly bleach linens until they were a uniform, respectable white. They spoke slowly, as if the language itself were a barrier, though my Lin's English was as precise and delicate as her stitching. She would thank them with a slight bow, her hands folded, her face a serene mask that they interpreted as vacancy. They saw her grey dress, with its high collar and simple lines, not as elegant, but as stubbornly foreign, a silent refusal to become like them. "She's a strange little thing," Beatrice would pronounce over the cracker barrel, her voice carrying the weight of communal consensus. "Hardly says a word. And what she does with those weeds, it's not natural." Her weeds were the town's great suspicion. Every morning, just after dawn when the light was soft and forgiving, my Lin would walk out not to the small, square vegetable patch Thomas had dutifully tilled for her, but past it, into the wilder lands beyond. She carried a woven basket and a small, sharp knife. She moved with a slow, deliberate grace, her eyes scanning the ground. She was not looking for what should be there, but for what already was. She gathered the flat, succulent leaves of purslane that hugged the hot ground, the jagged green stars of dandelion, the tender shoots of amaranth that the others cursed and ripped from their gardens. To them, it was pestilence. To her, it was providence. Thomas watched her with a troubled love. "My," he'd say, his voice gentle, his big, work-roughened hands twisting the brim of his hat. "The neighbors, they talk." Beatrice mentioned, "Well, she said it looks like we're destitute. That we're eating varmint food." My Lin would look up from the clay pot where she was simmering the greens with wild onions and a sliver of salt pork. Her expression wouldn't change, but a deep quiet would fill the space between them. "It is what the land provides, Thomas," she would say, her voice soft but not weak. "It is good food. Strong food." He would eat what she cooked, at first out of a husband's duty, then with a growing, secret appreciation. The flavors were new and peppery, earthy, sometimes a little bitter, but clean and nourishing. He felt a vigor he hadn't before, a lightness that the usual fare of beans, bacon, and bread could never provide. He saw the deep, healthy sheen of her black hair, the clear, bright calm in her eyes, and a part of him knew her truth was real. But the fear of his neighbors, the deep, primal need to belong to the herd, kept his praise confined to the walls of their own small home. He became her silent, shamefaced accomplice. The trouble began in June. The sky, usually a generous canvas of blue and white, settled into a flat, metallic glare. The rains, which should have come in soft, steady waves, simply stopped. At first, it was a novelty, a topic of conversation. "Another scorcher today," men would say, wiping sweat from their brows. But by July, the talk had dried up with the creek beds. The dust, once a minor annoyance, became a constant presence. It coated every surface, gritted between the teeth, and turned the evening sun into a bloody, apocalyptic smear. The gardens were the first to surrender. The proud tomato vines, laden with green, hopeful fruit, shriveled on the stalk. The corn, which had stood in neat, military rows, turned yellow and brittle, its tassels like the dry hair of an old woman. The squash plants withered, their broad leaves collapsing into blackened lace. The earth in the carefully tilled plots cracked into a mosaic of despair. The women would stand over their dying gardens, hands on their hips, their faces grim, and curse the merciless sky. Beatrice, at the general store, did a brisk trade in canned peaches and beans. "It's a trial from the Lord," she declared, her voice ringing with the certainty of one who controlled the last reliable source of food. "He's testing our faith. We must remain steadfast and pray for deliverance." Her gaze would often drift towards the edge of town, to the small house where the strange woman lived. It was noted, with growing resentment, that my Lynn's routine had not changed. She still walked out each morning with her basket. She still returned with it full of green, living things. The whispers grew teeth. "It's unnatural," one woman muttered to another over a fence line, looking at the vibrant, wild amaranth growing defiantly at the edge of my Lynn's yard while her own beans turned to dust. "What does she do to make them grow when everything else is dying?" "It's that foreign magic," another replied, her voice low and fearful. "She's drawing the life out of our soil and into her weeds." The logic was perverse, born of fear and envy, but it spread like a fever. They needed a reason for their suffering, a focus for their anxiety, and the quiet woman in the grey silk dress was the perfect vessel. She was other. She was different. And she was, inexplicably, thriving while they failed. The rising action of their scorn began subtly. A turned shoulder in the street. A sudden silence when she entered the general store. Thomas felt it most acutely. His friends at the saloon grew quiet when he approached. Jebediah, a rancher whose opinion carried the weight of a dozen lesser men, looked straight through him one afternoon, a deliberate, public shunning that felt like a physical blow. Thomas came home that night, his face a mask of frustration and pain. "They think you're a witch, he said, the words bursting out of him, raw and ragged. "They think you've cursed the town." My Lynn was kneading a small ball of dough made from cattail root flour. She paused, her hands white with the fine powder, and looked at him. Her gaze was steady, her dark eyes holding a sorrow that seemed ancient. She did not defend herself. She did not rage. She simply asked, "And you, Thomas? What do you think?" It was the question that broke him open. He looked at her, at the quiet competence of her hands, at the pantry that was still stocked with dried greens, preserved berries, and jars of pickled shoots. He thought of the nourishing meals she set before him each night, meals that were keeping him strong while other men grew gaunt and irritable. He looked at the fear in his own heart, the cowardly desire to be accepted by men he was beginning to realize he didn't even respect. The truth, his own and hers, rose up in him, solid and undeniable. He crossed the room in 2 strides and took her flour-dusted hands in his. "I think you are the wisest person I have ever known," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And I am a fool for not saying it louder." That night, he ate his meal of steamed purslane and smoked fish with a defiant gratitude. He was no longer her silent accomplice. He was her first convert. His conversion, however, did little to sway the town. If anything, it solidified their view of him as a bewitched man, a husband lost to the strange influence of his foreign wife. The midpoint of their ordeal, the crisis that would cement my Lynn as a pariah, arrived on a blistering August afternoon. A small group, led by Beatrice, marched to their small house. They did not knock. They stood in the yard, a grim deputation of righteous anger. Beatrice held up a withered, blackened tomato vine from her own garden. "This is your doing," she accused, her voice shaking with a fury that was part fear, part performance. "You come here with your strange ways and your devil's garden, and you've poisoned the land. You've stolen the rain from God's sky." The small crowd murmured in agreement. My Lynn stood on her porch, framed by the doorway, a still figure in her grey dress. She did not speak. Her silence seemed to infuriate them more than any argument could. "We are good, God-fearing people," Beatrice continued, her voice rising to a revivalist's pitch. "We don't hold with your kind of sorcery. You need to stop. You need to throw out those cursed weeds and pray for forgiveness like the rest of us." Thomas stepped in front of his wife, his body a solid shield. "That's enough, Beatrice," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You're talking nonsense and you know it. This is a drought. It has nothing to do with my wife." "Hasn't it?" sneered a man from the back. "She's the only one with green things to eat. Looks mighty suspicious to me." The confrontation ended with no resolution, just a cloud of heavier, more poisonous suspicion left hanging in the dead air. After that, they were truly alone. The store refused to sell them flour or salt. The blacksmith wouldn't reshoe their horse. They were cast out, an island of two in a sea of communal hostility. Mylin continued her foraging, though now she went earlier, deeper into the prairie, to avoid the hateful stares. Thomas took to hunting, using his knowledge of the land to bring back what little game had not fled the dry country. They survived, their world shrunk to the four walls of their house and the wild pantry of the plains. The turning point came not with a thunderclap, but with a quiet knock on the door. It was late September. The heat had not broken, and the town was beginning to look hollowed out. Faces were thinner, eyes were duller, and the bravado of summer had curdled into a brittle, anxious despair. On their doorstep stood Doc Hemlock, the town's physician. He was an old man, educated back east, a man of science who had seen too much of life to discount the mysteries. He was respected, his word carrying a different kind of weight than Beatrice's, the weight of fact, not fervor. He held his hat in his hands, a gesture of respect that did not go unnoticed by Thomas. "Mrs. Miller," he said, addressing Mylin directly. "Forgive the intrusion." His eyes went to the basket of greens by the door, which held a mix of lamb's quarters and prickly pear pads, their spines carefully removed. He pointed a gnarled finger. "That's Kenopodium album, isn't it? An opuntia. My grandmother used to make a poultice from the pads for burns. Said the greens were higher in iron than anything she could grow in her garden." Mylin nodded, her face unreadable. "I have a few patients," the doctor continued, his voice dropping. "The Wilsons, down the lane. Their stores are gone. The woman is weak, and the man is fading. They are proud. They won't ask for help. But they'll die without it. I was wondering if you could spare some of what the land provides." He used her own phrase, and in that moment, the first brick in the wall of their isolation crumbled. Mylin disappeared into the house and returned not just with a portion of her greens, but with a steaming broth in a sealed jar. She handed it to the doctor. She did not smile, but her eyes conveyed a deep, solemn understanding. He was the first to see her knowledge not as a threat, but as a resource. He was the validator, the bridge of trust they so desperately needed. The doctor's visit did not open the floodgates, but it created a crack. A few days later, Sarah, a young wife who lived 2 houses down, appeared at their back door after dusk, a shawl pulled over her head. She was a nervous, bird-like woman who had always been one of Beatrice's closest followers. Now, her eyes were wide with a desperation that had overwhelmed her allegiance. "My husband," she whispered, twisting a corner of her apron. "He has a fever. He won't eat." Doc Hemlock said, "He said you knew about herbs." Mylin studied her for a long moment, then simply nodded and gestured for her to come inside. She did not mention the time Sarah had pointedly crossed the street to avoid her. She did not bring up the whispers she had overheard. She simply saw the need. She prepared a tea from willow bark for the fever and sent Sarah home with a small basket of the softest, most easily digestible greens. This was how the repair began. Not with a grand apology or a town meeting, but one by one, in the quiet of the evening, with shamefaced knocks on the back door. Each visitor was a story of pride worn thin by hunger. Each was met with the same silent, non-judgmental grace. Mylin never spoke of the past. She never demanded an apology. She simply shared what she had, teaching them as she went. "This one," she would say, holding up a stalk of amaranth, "you must cook it well. The leaves are for strength," or, pointing to the dandelion roots, "dry these and boil them. It cleans the blood." They became her reluctant students. They learned to see the prairie not as a barren waste, but as a larder. Their vocabulary expanded to include words like purslane and plantain. They learned the difference between a nourishing root and a poisonous one. They did this in small groups, led by Sarah, who had become my Lynn's most devoted apprentice. They were still wary, still hesitant, but the gnawing in their bellies was a more powerful force than their prejudice. The most stubborn holdout was Jebediah, the rancher. He was a man carved from oak and granite, and his pride was legendary. He had lost half his herd and was living on jerky and grit. His public shunning of Thomas had been the cruelest cut. One afternoon in late October, as my Lynn and Thomas were mending a fence, they saw him walking up the road towards their house. He moved slowly, his usual confident stride replaced by a weary shuffle. He stopped at their gate, his face a roadmap of conflict. He stood there for a full minute, his gaze fixed on the ground. Finally, he looked up and met Thomas's eyes. He didn't speak to my Lynn, not directly. He spoke to her husband, man to man, in the town's preferred currency of communication. "Thomas," he said, his voice raspy. "My wife, she ain't eaten a green thing in 3 months. She's ailing." He swallowed hard, the motion visible in his thin neck. "I'd be obliged if your missus could see her way clear to help." It was the closest he could come to an apology, a public admission of his error and his need. Thomas looked at my Lynn. She gave a barely perceptible nod. "Come on in, Jebediah," Thomas said, his voice even, betraying no hint of triumph. "I'm sure we can find something for her." That act, more than any other, broke the back of the town's resistance. If Jebediah could humble himself, so could they. As autumn deepened into a harsh, lean winter, a new rhythm established itself in Providence Gulch. The foraging parties, once a solitary activity for a strange woman, were now a communal effort. My Lynn, in her practical grey dress, would lead small groups of women, pointing out the hardy wintercress and the edible roots that could be dug from the frozen ground. She was no longer an object of suspicion, but a figure of authority. They watched her hands, those hands they'd once scorned, and tried to mimic their deft, certain movements. They learned her quiet ways, discovering that the less you talked, the more you saw. The change was most visible in Beatrice. Her power, based on the control of scarce goods, had vanished when the most valuable goods became freely available to anyone with the knowledge to find them. Her store was nearly empty, her pronouncements no longer carried weight. One day, my Lynn saw her on the edge of the prairie, alone, clumsily trying to dig up a root she had seen the others gathering. She was failing, her movements angry and frustrated. My Lynn walked over, not in triumph, but in that same quiet way she approached everything. She knelt beside Beatrice, took the trowel from her hand, and with a few skilled movements, unearthed a large, healthy cattail root. She wiped the dirt from it and offered it to Beatrice. Beatrice stared at the root, then at my Lynn. Her face, for the first time, showed not anger or contempt, but a raw, naked humiliation. She snatched the root and walked away without a word. It was not a reconciliation. But it was a reckoning. The first snows came, blanketing the dead gardens and the dormant prairie. The town survived the winter on what my Lynn had taught them to gather and preserve. They were thinner, harder, but they were alive. And then, in late March, a miracle. A warm wind blew in from the south, carrying the smell of wet earth. The sky, that relentless brassy shield, softened to a pearly grey. And it began to rain. Not a furious, punishing downpour, but a soft, steady, soaking rain that fell for 3 straight days. It was a baptism. The townspeople stood on their porches, letting the water run over their faces, weeping with a relief so profound it felt like a physical pain. By spring, Providence Gulch was reborn. The creeks ran full, and the prairie exploded into a riot of green. The men went back to their fields, the women to their gardens. But something was different. As they planted their neat rows of beans and corn, they would now leave a patch of ground for the purslane to spread. They would see a dandelion and nod at it with a newfound respect. They had learned a deeper truth about the land, that it provides, but not always in the ways you expect or demand. The coda to their long trial came on a warm evening in May. Mylin and Thomas were sitting on their porch, the air sweet with the scent of rain-washed sage. The world was lush and alive again. They watched as Jebediah walked by, leading his horse. He paused at their gate, just as he had that day in October. He looked over at them, his face weathered but no longer hostile. He simply touched the brim of his hat in a slow, deliberate gesture of respect. A nod. It was a small thing, but it was everything. Mylin watched him go, her hands resting calmly in her lap. She had not conquered the town, nor had she sought its approval. She had simply held to her own truth, quietly and steadfastly, until the world was forced to bend to it. The land had provided, as she always knew it would. It had provided food. It had provided hardship. And in the end, it had provided a hard one, silent, and deeply satisfying peace.